Hello and welcome to yet another episode on the White Dog Garage YouTube channel. My name is Bob. In this episode we're going to be looking at a simple woodworking project. We recently bought this stick vacuum. It needs a bracket to sit on the wall, keep it out of the way, and this is about where it's going to go, and we're going to go away and make a bracket and come back and fit it. I've drawn this simple diagram of the bracket that I wanted to make. I'm going to make it out of some scrap wood. Actually don't have any set measurements, it'll just depend on what I find. However, what I do need to take note of is that this semicircular recess here will have to be big enough to take the 110mm diameter barrel of the stick vacuum. And I will also need a notch down here that will need to be 15mm wide by 10mm deep to accommodate the latch that secures the bottom of the barrel to the vacuum. I used a 114mm or 5.5-inch hole saw to cut the semicircle that formed the barrel rest. This type of hole saw screws onto the arbor, but before it bottomed out on the flange, two driving dogs were wound down to engage a diagonally opposite pair of the 4 holes located in the base. I then mounted the hole saw in the bench drill. For this project I recycled an old pine bookshelf. You don't need to cut a full circle in the piece of timber to form the semicircle. I positioned the pilot drill of the hole saw in the centre of the pine shelf, down about 25mm or an inch from the top edge. With the semicircle cut out, it was off to the compound miter saw to cut it and the remaining components that will make up the bracket. I decided to style up the wall plate just a little with some mitered corners, for which I set the saw at 45 degrees. I then used a 3/8 of an inch roundover bit in the router table to trim the top and bottom edges of the wall plate. With all the pieces cut out, I did a dry fit. Happy with that, I moved on to cutting out the notch at the bottom of the barrel rest. Having cut down the sides, I opted to chisel out the piece to be removed. At which point Disaster struck and the barrel rest broke in two as I attempted to chisel out the notch. Lots of issues here. The pine was old and dry. I probably should have cut the notch area into feathers before attempting to chisel it out. I could have set the router up to take out the notch. There's probably many others that I'm sure you, the audience of the video, can point to. What to do? I didn't actually have any more of the pine shelf left, or sufficient of it left to make a new barrel bracket. At this point I was a little bit unsure, and then I thought, I know how I will do this. If you're a woodworker watching this video, you should probably avert your eyes now, because I'm about to launch into some bush carpentry, which you may not approve, but it achieves a result in the end. So, trying to recover the disaster, the barrel rest had broken along one side of the notch, so I used the tenon saw to cut the bottom of the notch and remove it. Then I drove 2 light gauge nails into the face of the brake. Followed by nipping the heads off with pliers. I then used the other pieces of the bracket to form an alignment jig for bringing the 2 pieces together. Putting glue on the broken edges, I used a mallet to drive the second piece onto the nails protruding from the first, and then down to form the joint. I then used a series of clamps to hold the piece together until the glue set. I placed a piece of plastic sheet between the jig pieces and the joint. This was to prevent any unwanted adhesion due to glue squeeze out. You, the viewer, probably have your own opinion on what I should have done to rejoin the pieces, for example using a flat metal bracket behind the brake to hold it together. Please feel free to make a comment below on what you might have done. I'm happy to show my mistakes and how I fix them, but your suggestions might be better than mine, and they also help another viewer to fix their problem. The clamping arrangement looked complex, but it was designed to make sure the 2 sides of the joint remained flat whilst the glue cured. I left the joint to set overnight before removing and sanding all of the bracket pieces. The joint was noticeable in the raw finish, but was invisible after the bracket was painted. Then it was on to assembling the bracket. I used an awl to mark my screw positions before drilling the screw holes in the front and rear sections of the bracket. I used a countersink bit to recess the screw head positions. The countersinks were drilled deep enough to allow a good covering of putty over the screw heads prior to their final sanding and painting. I then glued and screwed the bracket together. With the bracket completed, it was off to be painted the colour of the wall that it will be mounted on. The wall is plasterboard, and I'm just using some simple little plasterboard plugs that screw in. So, before I get started, there's a PowerPoint here. The way it works in Australia generally, or certainly the state that I live in, is that there's probably a wall stud here, because the PowerPoints are invariably put adjacent to the wall stud. There'll be either one there or one there. There'll be flex cable coming up to that PowerPoint, either from down under the floor or from up in the ceiling. Usually the lights are in the ceiling and the power is under the floor, but you can never count on that. There's unlikely to be anything over here. So, apart from being a convenient spot, it's also a spot away from the PowerPoint in the wall. We're going to go about here. If you ever need to move it, it's quite simple. You just reverse it out and then just plug up the hole. And just to finish the job off, a couple of little screw covers. And with that, we're all done.